Hello and welcome to episode number 7 of this podcast. My name is Elliot Greenman and I host it with my friend Alexi Anel. This week's podcast is about a psychotherapy framework called the Human Givens that both of us are studying at the moment. It's a very interesting framework. I would say for me it links a lot of different therapeutic methods from all over the world, from a massive span of time, and it kind of gives them a bit of it puts them in a framework, and so yeah, it's quite an interesting one. We go off on a few tangents, but I hope you get something from it and enjoy.
Perambulations in franglais.
No, I think the main thing about that humanistic way of doing it is quite interesting, and it's quite patient-centered as well. So I was listening to a nice little podcast from Jordan Peterson about phenomenological ideas, in a way, and Carl Rogers, which is existential and phenomenologist, in a way, and it really reflects a bit the whole patient-centered therapy in a way, and I think that's quite an interesting way, basically. So you really want the patient to tell you the truth, and you need to install ambience or a setup that's actually conducive for people to be really themselves in a way, really, and you must not make too many, everything that the patient tells you should be really taken as face value, and it's always quite an interesting thing rather than being a bit too judgmental about the whole lot in a way, really. So that's quite interesting, really. And then Joe Griffin and Ivan Tyrrell and their Human Givens is really in that vein in terms of really giving people a framework to be able to work around, really, with some innate resources and some emotion, or physical, of course, and emotional needs that need to be fulfilled, really, in a bit of a balanced fashion, really. So there's loads of different concepts important to actually look into. There's right and left brain kind of way of functioning. There's that concept of catextia, especially at the moment, which is really super important as well in terms of that context blindness part of things, and the more aroused we are, the least we see the tree from the forest, in a way, really, and the more we fall into one of our brain. So if we fall a bit too much in our left brain, we get a little bit autistic, we get a bit callous, a bit not very emotional, we get a bit sequential, really. So it becomes a bit like warped in a way, really. And then if we go into our right brain, we go a little bit schizoid and psychotic. So we become a bit emotional, we get a bit, lots of lateral thinking. It's a very imaginary type world, a little bit we access, all those kind of stuff, which is interesting, but again, without the left brain to keep in check, I think it's difficult. And once, or it's difficult, no, it warps your model of reality a little bit, and it's not helping you to find solutions that kind of help you to alter a little bit your view of reality in a way. And I think that's a bit the tricky part in a way.
In Joe Griffin and Ivan Tyrrell's book Godhead, they describe it as mechanistic and mentalistic.
And mentalistic, yes, that's it. It's quite a good way of actually segregating the two hemispheres. Yeah.
It's almost like chaos and order.
Chaos and order is the same. Jordan Peterson would really agree with that, and I think there was like this couple of other ways to actually describe it, but I think it's because it's always a bit difficult to. There's lots of school of thought about what the brain and the two hemispheres are on about, and how lateral, like how how they function a bit differently, or language, for example, and the acquisition of language is mostly to do with, we've done loads of tests with that, with all the Broca and Wernicke area. So you need to be able to vocalize the whole thing and then hear your own voice. And from there's a feedback loop a little bit with things in order to be able to speak. And it's really mostly on the left side of the brain, basically. But we notice when people have got a cerebrovascular accident or strokes on their left brain, and you compare men and women, we've got men having much more difficulty to actually recuperate or improve from the aphasia they tend to suffer from a stroke on the left brain, basically, compared to women who seem to be actually recovering the acquisition of language a bit faster. And there's a lot of things saying that maybe, or actually there is, a lot of the right brain in women that is actually involved in language, basically. But maybe the way the language is actually constructed, it becomes a bit different as well, in a way. So it's a bit more imaginary, a bit more metaphorical, rather than a bit too realistic type description.
And literal.
And literal, exactly, that's it. So
that's something that I always think about when I hear people talking about struggles within a relationship, and specifically heterosexual relationship, and whether it's a girl I hear or a man, and how they're like,
but I think
I can never get them to understand me.
Yeah,
and it's the way that they will use their language, and the way that they see reality is. I mean, everyone sees reality slightly differently, more than likely.
Yeah.
But the way they actually use their language is different to the way that men do. And often communicating that could be quite interesting.
Yeah, and sometimes a bit you have to remember one of the resources we have as humans is we pattern match a little bit, really. And I think sometimes the language we use and the tone of our voice or the phrasing of it, whether we do imperative tense or a question or different thing, can be interpreted and pattern matched by your partner as antagonizing in a way, really. So I think we have to be a bit not too cliche. Well, it's a bit cliche, but it's actually an interesting way of looking at it. Of course, somebody who's a bit more left-brained. So, because the heterosexual type thing is not really especially relevant here, because I'm pretty sure there's some same-sex relationship where the one of the conjoint is actually a bit more into his left or her left brain, and the other one is maybe a bit more in his or her right brain, and therefore that's a bit the whole dichotomy between the two, really. And I think we have had the tendency to classify men a bit more on average into their left brain, rather than women on average being a bit more on their right brain. But it doesn't exclude the fact that some women are a bit more left brain and men are a bit more right brain.
Yeah, of course.
And maybe part of the gender push and the fact that some people want to really belong to a group a little bit and have like a status as well, and the attention they require. We tend to have developed certain new genders or new ways of organizing genders, and they are possibly just driven by a discrepancy between the left and the right brain in a way, really. So I think that would be quite...
like there being no black and white, almost like a dimmer switch between the two kind of thing. Like the discrepancy between using the two is where those different genders kind of almost...
That's it. And... We had spoken a bit about feminism at some stage, a little bit, where the overarching type thing was women wanting to be equal to men. In a way, there's much more subtleties to the whole thing, really. And I think it pushed a lot women into their left brain, in a way. And so there's the men who are mostly in their left brain, and now women have been pushed with that feministic type or feminism movement a bit more into their left brain. So we've got a world that is even more dominated by left brain, which isn't really a problem too much in a way, because, or it is in other ways. A lot of people who can monetize their jobs, a lot of jobs and a lot of talents we have are monetized when you're a bit more in your left brain, compared to being in your right brain. So you play the guitar really well, and you're an artist, you're very creative, which actually we all need some creativity around us, but how well equipped are you to actually run a business or actually monetize your skill really and make a living out of it really? So we can see a little bit the tendency for everybody to go into that left brain, running a business, doing accounts, marketing, all those kind of stuff, and organizing your week, all those kind of things. You can't really improvise every week. You need something a bit square, a bit more linear, a bit more sequential, which requires your left brain to really dominate a bit things really, and that's how you can really monetize things really, compared to if you're a bit too much in your right brain, a bit too much artistic, and it's a bit like free flow a little bit. Well, it's not really as
a bit too chaotic, and so the Western society and maybe even like the mercantile aspect and the mercantile focus there is in our society is actually commanding or demanding people to be a bit more in their left brain really. So no wonder women were actually a little bit more warped in their choice to actually go into their left brain, rather than asking their blokes a little bit to be a bit more in their right brain, in a way, really. And it would have been maybe creating a bit of a world that was a bit more altruistic or something like that, really. But I guess there's a bit of a backlash to that thing, and I guess, well, my grandfather has got a bit of a different gender than mine, and I'm looking a bit more after the kids. I'm a bit more involved at home with homework with the kids, like taking them to school and cooking, all those kind of stuff a bit, and doing the dishes and putting the laundry, vacuuming, all those kind of stuff really, which was a bit more what women didn't want to actually do anymore because they had done it a bit too much really. So like my grandma was a bit more woman, and my wife is a bit more man in a way really, and my granddad was a bit more man and a bit more woman in a way. That's so very sexist of you.
Well, that's it.
Compare them to old women and
new age women. New age women, exactly.
I find that quite interesting because the idea of, like, with the gender pay gap and people talking about that and getting really angry about it, and they're really focusing on that. I think it was like 80 cents to the dollar, and they're just jumping to a very literal, maybe too left brain conclusion that it's purely down to genitals, and it's purely men, like the tyrannical patriarchy oppressing women. But in reality, it looks like it's the more left brain way of the nature of society that has created lots of scalable products and things that we want to buy. And the more scalable a product, the more money you can make through it, and then therefore earn more money. Otherwise you go off to the next company that will pay you more, blah, blah, blah.
That's it.
And so we're all focusing on a very left brain way of...
Or little black and white. Black and
white. But in reality, what we need is definitely a slightly more matriarchal, let's say, and slightly more right brain, or like a bit more balance between the two.
So to go back towards the right brain. But remember, the pay gap thing is an interesting conundrum a bit, really, and I think we have to stop focusing on people's gender. We need to focus on people's skills and people's capacities and abilities
The individual.
of individuals, really, rather than that's the thing, really. So Mr. Trudeau in Canada does a government, and he boasts the stuff about having 50% women and 50% men. But if that's what matters, I don't think it really matters, really.
No.
We need people who are competent in the job, really. And unfortunately, a lot of high-end jobs and managerial jobs are a bit more demanding on the left brain, and therefore men seem to be a bit more equipped with their left brain on average to actually keep those jobs and actually do well with those jobs. Not to say that women are not capable of doing it, but they are a bit more, on average, a bit more into their right brain and a bit more interested in nurturing children, and they've got other skills, they've got other set of skills, but it isn't really monetized in society, and that's the whole problem, really.
That's the issue. But,
That's the thing,
but
really.
the men in high-paid jobs is also, I mean, it's multi-pronged, because not only is it generally, it like panders more to the left brain.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, you being in your right brain is more emotional and more nurturing, as you said, and therefore generally they want over a certain amount of money. Women generally are happy earning that and then want to spend time with their kids. But men, being more left brain rather than right brain, generally means that they're probably more happy doing something that is more stimulating for the left brain, work, rather than going home and spending time with
the kids. Exactly, yeah. And it's actually quite... Anyway, so it's on average, and then we were listening to an interesting thing about the research that have been done by a lot of sociologists about the Scandinavian countries, and that quite authoritative left like socialist governments who tend to have actually pushed society and changed a bit the way people's opportunities were actually laid off for them, and they were trying to even out the opportunities men and women were having, or women were having compared to men, and trying to really level the whole lot and to try to have
closer to 50% of each gender in
That's it.
majority of roles, especially STEM fields.
That's it. And it turns out 20 or 30 years down the line that there's never been as much discrepancy in between men and women in the workplace, because when the whole difference is mitigated, I think on average a lot of women would rather spend time with their kids. That's it, really, because that's what they are really wired to do, really.
Okay,
Not to say that men aren't, but
with that,
it's just
the majority of people would say that that's because of the tyrannical patriarchy.
no, because the government has actually mitigated all the whole thing actively and quite in an authoritative fashion. So it's not like a very right-sided or like a capitalistic type thing. The Scandinavian governments are quite socialist, and they've actually very actively tried to mitigate the whole thing. So it's actually not patriarchal at all. It's really what we talk about socialism, trying to even out everything and forgetting a little bit that people have got different skills and different abilities and different propensions, and on average, over a population, it actually seems to there's a discrepancy between men and women. We can't do the same thing on average. Not that individually we should not be kind of incentivized to try to do the same thing in a way, but people a bit too much in their left brain are going to be able to monetize themselves in certain types of jobs that tend to be highly more paid in Western and capitalistic type environment compared to people who are more in their right brain. That's it, really. I think that's really a bit the whole problem, really. And
we haven't worked out how to pay more for right brain.
But that's it. That's it. So there is a bit of a demand potentially to actually look at all those creative and all those maybe more altruistic, more caring, more. You look at nurses. The majority of nurses are women, and they are very badly paid, really. When actually they are the backbone of the NHS or the health system in general, really.
Yeah,
That's it, really.
Society.
Or society, exactly. And it's not really well paid. You look at teachers, the majority of teachers are women, and then all the rest, really. I think it's all those things, really. And then it requires a little bit to open up and to enable people who are a little less wired, or not less wired, but less not able, because it's really bad to say that, because it's just like less inclined, possibly, to actually access their left brain and do the whole due diligence to those kind of jobs than others who are a bit more right brain and a bit more creative and caring and altruistic and turn towards others, really, in a way, really. Turn towards the world, really.
And like one of the biggest ones from my perspective is the empathy, which patient, like, from that comes patience, and when you're working with people, that really, really helps. Like being able to empathize with that person, then therefore have patience with them. If you're not able to empathize, you become incredibly frustrated very quickly.
But remember, we talked about agreeableness, we talked about neuroticism, we talked about conscientiousness, we talked about openness to experience, we talked about different things that can be measured and to try to correlate different traits in a way. So conscientiousness would be the best personality trait that actually reflect your success in a Western and a bit more mercantile environment in a way. So when you're an artist, you don't have much conscientiousness, unfortunately, really. Or fortunately, but it doesn't pay as much, and I think that's a bit to do with the conscientiousness, really, in a way. So all those traits of personality are actually quite, and I think that's the agreeableness you're talking about a little bit, because empathizing is another, and sympathizing is there's quite a bit of a subtle. This, I think, is agreeableness a little bit, really. Anyway, but that's we diverge a little bit, or we went down on the track again, down the rabbit hole or the badger hole a little bit again, because it's a never-ending type thing. But that's where it's an interesting way to look at gender difference with what the right and the left brain difference are actually doing. And when you look at neuropsychology a little bit, it's bringing to the table different arguments and different ways, and it reflects maybe the reality a bit better. And the little post we've put this week on our Facebook, it's a bit about the fact that knowledge is very good to be used, and we can use knowledge quite nicely, really, and belief tend to actually uses us in a way. So if you believe a bit the gender thing, well, you get a bit more easily into a bit of a black and white way of thinking, and you don't have enough arguments in terms of, and not enough knowledge about the subject, and you get a bit polarized in your view, really, rather than, is it really that bad to be a man and to be able to earn some money for the job that you're maybe more wired to do, really? That's it, really. But that's it, really.
That's not the argument. The argument is
it's not fair.
If they're doing the same job.
That's it. It's not fair.
That's
it's not fair. It's not even an argument. It's not even.
You can't. It's a statement.
Yeah, and it's a meaningless statement.
But it's again. There's another post that you did this week of something along the lines of to see both sides will guarantee that you don't solve the problem.
That's it.
Every problem has more than two sides.
That's it.
That's the exact same thing again, because it's like some two people might have identical jobs and do the exact same role,
Yeah.
but your job isn't just the time that you're paid to be there.
That's it.
Your job is everything.
And the one who's a bit paid a bit less is possibly a bit more agreeable.
Quite possibly.
That's it.
But that's what
That's
I mean.
it.
It's like
On average,
everything
that's
that
it.
you do like accumulates to who you are and what you do to other things. Like everything's linked. So outside of work, you're still doing things that are affecting your work and etc. etc. And so there would never ever be two identical situations.
Of course.
And it's again talking about how instead of identifying someone as a group, which is a way too simple way to talk to identify someone, it's like we need to be identifying people as an individual first.
Yeah. And then we need to really stop talking about fairness because it doesn't really exist. And we need to talk about responsibility. It's not anybody else's fault, but you take responsibility for the whole thing yourself. And I think it solves quite a lot of problems in a way. And there's far less headache about the thing, really. That's all. But yeah, when we want to try to mitigate those things, it's all like humankind, really. I think we've always not done the same thing, really. Women never went hunting, or not as many women went hunting than men.
They didn't have the opportunity, though.
Didn't they? Yeah. I don't know. The government was not giving them an incentive.
I'm pretty sure that most people who didn't have to go and do a dangerous thing would probably be relatively happy that they didn't have to go and do a dangerous thing.
Women seems to go to war nowadays in the army, but for the longest time they never went. So
but they weren't allowed in the army, though.
As I said, yeah, they could have made a women army, but anyway, that's the thing, really. It's just like anyway, but.
It's all the same thing, really.
Yeah. It's the same thing, and we can't really solve the whole thing by just talking about fairness, and that's this responsibility. You take responsibility for the whole thing that is happening to you, and we talk about other people who need to not think that it's not fair or fair. They need to be able to take responsibility for their own lives, really.
There's always something.
And the outcome for all their actions is really leading to that. And maybe knowing themselves a bit better, and all of a sudden, you're very agreeable, and therefore you're not going to want to be too confrontational with your boss, and therefore when he's actually telling you, you're going to be paid a bit less than the bloke who does the same job, instead of telling him to F off and to get another, to go somewhere else, and to tell him, find somebody else, because I'm actually very competent, I'm actually very conscientious, I'm very enthusiastic, I'm very driven about the whole lot, and if you pay me less, find somebody else. That's it, really. But if you got a mortgage, and if you go shopping every Wednesday and Saturday and Sunday as well, and you got a big credit card bill, and you got 4 kids instead of maybe you go to private school, and you got a big car, and then a whole lot, all of a sudden, you're less likely to actually tell the guy to F off, and that's it, really. So you do, why is it you do the job you do, really? In a way, really. So you do it to be paid in order to pay your credit card. So that's good. So because that's the reason why you're not actually getting rid of the job. So yeah, tricky. Tricky. It's tricky. You're not telling your boss because you're a bit too agreeable about the whole lot, and you take responsibility for that, or you actually whinge because you don't have more money than the bloke who does the same job, but actually you haven't actually told the boss because you think that if you tell him he's going to sack you and you need the money, and because you do the job for the money. Well, no. So we need to make the argument a little bit more solid than that, really. That's it, really. There's, yes, what is the reason why you do the job? That's it, really. And why is it you don't take it? Or quit it, really? Okay, bye! I can go somewhere else and find another job. There's plenty of jobs, plenty of work, plenty of opportunities. There's lots of countries, all those kind of stuff. But I don't speak another language. Well, yeah, you don't. Well, learn, huh? That's it, really. Your responsibility. But I've got a big credit card bill. Yeah. Yep. Well, is it not fair
Yeah.
That's it, really. So you made certain decisions and you actually whinge about the difference in pay, but you're not actually willing to actually stand for the whole thing because you think there are other things that are more needed for the money you're going to get there. It doesn't, I don't know. It's another way of looking at it. Whether it's right or not is one thing, really. But I think we have to be quite honest and truthful about the whole lot in a way at times. And yes, there has been a lot of oppression, monetary control from men to women. And a lot of the time, women have actually possibly agreed for the whole thing to happen, really, in a way. Instead of saying, well, you come back home and then you cook your own bloody dinner, really, mate. I've dealt with the kids, I've dealt with the whole lot. You want your shirt ironed? Well, wake up 10 minutes early and then you put the starch into the whole stuff and you put that in your collar. Huh? Okay, on your bike. And then you see a bit the difference, really, because if it's a woman who's really at home and she thinks that she's really oppressed and the whole lot, she's got the control of the household, really. So that's the thing, really. And if she thinks she's manipulated and controlled with the money the bloke is coming back in with, well, yeah, that's another thing, but you don't have to cook his dinner, really. Oh yeah, and then so that's the thing, really. Where do we stop? Where do we escalate the whole lot? How do we look at it from, really? And is it really relevant in a way, really? Is there other more relevant thing to talk about than that, really? In a way, really.
Well, yeah, I think we
That's
started
it, really.
the conversation with the left, like talking about the
Left and right brain. That's it.
I think the neuropsychology is a really interesting way of approaching it. And I wanted to talk a bit about the Human Givens, I guess the psychotherapy course that we both like. And I really like their approach because it's very matter of fact, and they have a very solid framework, both with regards to the emotional needs, but also with the APET model and how to actually be a therapist and how our emotions and thoughts are triggered, or the full story of how that's triggered.
Or the algorithm.
And I think the idea of addressing it or talking about it with the left and the right side of the brain, for me, is fascinating because we all have a left and right side of the brain and they all work the same.
And then it's all a bit about diagnoses a little bit, and then how do you qualify mental health a little bit, how do you put people into boxes in a way as well, so because we've got a tendency nowadays to put the people and segregate people in smaller and smaller groups that become completely irrelevant almost, so people who are manic depressive, people, all the different depression, the different labels that we tend to put on mental health as well as physical health, I'm pretty sure, tend to be quite almost irrelevant in a way. You go into your left brain, and if you have not got the ability to look the world from your right brain, you cannot be imaginative, you cannot be all-encompassing, you cannot be altruistic, and therefore you become a bit autistic in your way of doing things, really.
Yeah, but it's almost as if today, in today's society, we're really eager to like label whatever you've got as a thing.
Yep.
So like Asperger's or dyspraxic or dyslexic or whatever. But that, like, it's almost as if someone gets a label for their son and they're like, oh, phew, it's confirmed that they've got this thing. And it's like, but how does that help? So it's not helping anyone.
For parents, it helps maybe the parent, but it doesn't help the individual because it doesn't reflect his own reality. In a way, really. Being diagnosed is not really helping the person for actually being, for his mode of reality to be understood and integrated with the rest of everybody, really, in a way. And I think that's quite a tricky thing because there's no black and white way of talking about autism. We talk about spectrum in a way, really. We talk about a shade of grey, really. Or a grey shade, like I like to say. So it's quite it's all those things really. And in the course we will film at some stage and the second part and how to apply a little bit the knowledge the information we have actually put forward in terms of pain. There will be no diagnosis. We will not do something for sciatica. We're gonna do, or for knee pain, or for meniscal tear. We're not gonna do anything like that. We're gonna do for leg-itis. We're gonna do for back-itis and arm-itis and head-itis. So it's just like an inflammatory process in your leg.
And
in a way,
the thought process behind that is.
The fact that you know it's sciatica doesn't really help you. And is it really sciatica, or is it something that resembles sciatica? It doesn't matter in a way, really.
And it doesn't seem beneficial for anyone to focus on the thing they've got.
That's it. The tissue causing pain is preventing you from focusing on the reason why it's actually not getting better.
Yeah,
that's the main problem.
And so I used to say that to some people that I think I'm a little bit autistic because at times I can definitely use my left brain or seem to be more in my left side of my brain than my right side of my brain. But it's like
that makes you good at editing videos for podcast, Elliot. Well done.
Maybe
well done.
I need to be more in that side. But
that's it.
It's like it's like, okay, what does that mean? Like,
and does it matter?
Does it like?
The thing is to know.
I might be slightly autistic, or I might be slightly this, or I might be slightly that. But it's like, that is literally like reading the title of a book and not understanding anything about it, not going any deeper. It's like you can do that if you want, but you're never going to learn anything. You're not going to expand your knowledge.
Yeah.
But if you approach things from, again, a bit more of like a neuro. Psychological perspective on like how your brain actually works. I think that's very interesting. And again, bringing it back to the Human Givens, Joe Griffin and Ivan Tyrrell, both psychologists themselves, I believe, the way that they talk about it's almost a left brain way of laying out the framework. Really, it's like it's quite.
Well, the framework is left brain. That's it.
Because then it's up to you to apply your. I guess this is how I view it.
Your
anyway,
right brain,
your chaos to it, which is the content of your story. So they kind of supply you a bit with the context.
The context,
and you then put your narrative and your story over the top of that, and it's almost like you've got like a grid, and with that story over the top, you can really start to figure out a bit more about yourself and how you work.
Yeah.
And I think that's for more.
Or your belief about if you're a bit greedy for control, for example, well, you always think you want more control than you actually need. So you might have in your head you don't have enough of the one thing you already got a lot of, and that's a bit the tricky part. So it warps you a little bit really, and the way. You don't know, like how is it you approach somebody and you try to help them and sympathize with them, if that's what you're referring to a little bit, or you try to give them a hand if they're asking you for a bit of help. Are you talking to them about the fact that they've completely messed up their business relationship and they're bankrupt, their business is getting bankrupt, or do you talk to them about being a bit control freaks, really? Are they going to be more emotional with talking about the bankruptcy of the whole business and the relationship they had with their business partner and all those kind of things and all the story behind it? And then he did that, and then he did that, and then he did that, and then I did that, and then he didn't do that, and then okay? Rather than saying you're a control freak and you think you've got not enough control compared to how much control you already have, really. So you're getting warped and stressed and pushed into your left brain, and you're not really imaginative enough to actually find solutions because of that, really, for the problem, really. And that becomes far less arousing. So your friend is not going to bawl his eyes off, but he's going to actually maybe even chuckle a bit because he knows he's a control freak. That's the whole thing, really. But and that's the context a little bit. It's about his perception of control. And if he was to actually reframe a little bit his perception of how much control he has, he thinks he has, and he gets a bit closer to how much control he really has, well, there's less stress, and therefore there's more ability for him to go a bit into his right brain, to be a bit more imaginative about problem solving for his business or something like that, really, in a way. But again, we go back to it's about communication a bit. So you got resources about the pattern matching, the rapport. It's all about rapport. How is it you build rapport with people a little bit, really? How do you mimic? Some people are not very good at mimicking people's body language, all those kind of stuff, and it actually prevents them from having access to an easy platform to be able to communicate with people, really. And how is it you mimic people's voice and the tone of voice and the phrasing of your language and things like that, really. I think it's quite a resource that is quite an important thing, really. And from a human given point of view. And then you got the pattern matching in a way, really. So, yeah, and in the previous business, he was doing that, and then it was really annoying, and then he thought he was doing it now, and then, so you really pattern match compared to something that has happened to you before, which was quite emotionally laden, and therefore you completely miss the point completely, really. Instead of being able to just step back a little bit and you go into that quick conclusion drawing in a way, really, okay? So the pattern matching is quite an important thing, really, on that aspect for interpersonal relationships, really, in a way. And for an individual as well, and then I talk about for no apparent reason for people doing their back-in, and basically that's a pattern matching, and the firing sequence of muscle in their back and their lumbar spine and then their abdominal wall and things like that is very similar to the time when they hurt it before, really. And the whole spasm that is triggered is maybe a bit linked as well with the emotional state they're in at the time as well, and the level of stress and things, and then there's a bit of a pattern matching loop that is happening, really. So there's the amygdala, the right and the left, are crude pattern matching is really important. It's like even an evolutionary tool, really, to be able to deal with your change in your environment in a way, really, and to be safe, really. They can booby trap you a little bit, really. So without even talking about the needs, talking about the resources that you have at your disposal, it's already quite difficult, really, you know. How is it you pattern match, and how is it you build rapport? How do you use your imagination? So if you're a bit autistic, you're not going to use your imagination very well. And if you're completely schizoid or psychotic in your full out in your right brain, well, your imagination is like Quentin Tarantino. It's like
tripping you over.
That's it. It becomes completely like it's exuberant, really, a little bit, really. And that's maybe not.
And that's where bringing a little bit of order, or a little bit more of your like trying to bring some
framework.
Yeah,
that's it.
It could be really advantageous.
That's it.
To do that, because then you're able to almost like harness that imagination on your right side.
That's it. And you might not have to use your left brain too much because somebody brings you a framework and you follow it. It's not too difficult to follow it.
Or you know, if in a business sense, or if you're an artist, for example, and you're a bit schizoid or a bit psychotic, but your art was incredible, then obviously someone to help you, like an agent or a personal assistant or something, to be able to bring a little bit of that left brain side of things into your life, it's like that's going to work really well.
No doubt. So, but that's a bit
the idea of us not it's like we're not helping each other, or we're not the conversation we're having isn't helping us view things from this perspective. And I think you said this a number of times, but I know they also, I'm pretty sure I've heard it from other places, including the Human Givens. It's like, what minds are we missing out on? Because the way that we approach mental health and the way that we approach depression, anxiety, and humans in general isn't beneficial. It's not. It doesn't seem to be beneficial. And like, what minds are we missing out on because we're not addressing it in a beneficial way?
That's it. There's a bit of a waste of diversity in a way, of people's way of actually processing the world with their left and their right brain, and a proportion of the two. And saying, of course, yes, that's completely true, really. But the main thing is it's humans who deal with mental health on humans. So the whole therapist has got a mind himself, really, and that's the whole thing, really. If he doesn't apply the model, if he's applying a model that doesn't reflect reality, but as he's been taught, he's not going to help. He's not going to be able to help others, really, to figure out the whole thing, really, in a way, really. That's the main thing, really, because there's all the status, there's all the controls, there's all the security and the safety, there's all the competence, there's all the everything, really. It's all the attention and things like that, really. So from a medicalized point of view, it's a bit warped in a way, really. Oh, that's what I've been taught. Well, yeah, but things change. And there are different ways to actually look at it. You need to update your knowledge a little bit, and it's a bit difficult to actually navigate the whole thing, really. And mental health is a big, big field where there's far too many ways of approaching things, which are not completely irrelevant, but they are not completely relevant. With it, we find a unifying way of actually approaching people's mind. Not their brain, but their mind, in a way.
It's like the reason why I think the Human Givens is it is the best model I've come across, and why I don't think other models are particularly great is because there's lots of gaps in other models. But that doesn't mean something like CBT is always going to be ineffective for two reasons. One, it's not all bad, and two, you're still seeing a therapist, and the therapists themselves, although they're using a model, they'll interpret that model in a different way, and then they'll practice that in a different way, and then over time, if they're good, they'll change how they practice that, because they'll notice this might be more effective for this person, etc., etc. And them as a therapist is going to be different from CBT as a model. And what I found really interesting or fascinating about the Human Givens is that every other form of therapy that I'm aware of fits really well into it. Like, there's aspects of it, so, shall I say, that that explain why that type of therapy can be quite effective. But as you say,
so it's a bit of an overarching kind of meta model that actually goes over all the different models, and all the different models have got a part of a place in that overarching model, which is interesting. Yeah, CBT is good, and it's about it's about efficacy or efficiency, or the speed at which you can solve problem, all those kind of stuff. And some people respond better to others, but they don't quite know, because they don't know themselves well enough, and they don't have a framework they can use, really. And in the Human Givens, behavioral techniques are very used an awful lot as well, in order to help people to change certain behaviors. That's it, really. But to change certain ways of seeing the world, CBT is maybe not the best way, in a way, really. Or changing your knowledge about how you function, CBT might not be the best way.
And that's where trauma comes into it, isn't it? Because in order to help someone with trauma, you have to help them change the way they see the world, or the way that they see the traumatic experience. And if you're just going in on a behavioral therapy, then we talk about the APET model, and behavioral therapies, they only I'm only aware of them focusing on the E and the T, the emotion and the thought.
Or the thought and the emotion.
Yeah.
So it's in the wrong way,
the wrong way
or
around.
round. Yeah.
And whereas the Human Givens talks more about the
Activating agent
and then
and the pattern matching.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so what if you focus, from my understanding, if you focus on the emotion and the thought, or the thought and the emotion, you can help someone control kind of their emotion and their thought on very low level things. But when it's quite a traumatic thing and your whole body has the activating agent happens, then your whole body in lots of different ways has the pattern matching, you're not going to have an awful lot of control over the emotion or the thought, which is why, even though it might help you from having, I don't know, less suicidal thoughts, or being able to control your mind about sleep or whatever it is, if you're actually having a really traumatic experience where you're walking down the street and there's like a crude pattern matching going on, because the light, like you said before, the light's flickering, it's wet on the pavement, it's a certain light, and etc., and that reminds you of a traumatic experience you've had.
It doesn't
That's the activating agent.
It doesn't remind you. You don't have any consciousness. You don't have any.
Sure, yeah.
You don't even remember it's happening. But part of your brain is kicking up, and it gets activated and crudely pattern match and gives you that flat and fright response, which actually is there to protect you in a way. So it's a normal thing. It's automated in a way, but it's seen as a really quite negative thing to experience. So the physical experience you have as well, the emotion, because I think emotion is sensation as well. That's where a bit the confusion can be, really. Emotion and sensation are a bit the same thing on that APET model, really. So it could be a pest or something like that. The E and the S would be a bit the same thing, because when the autonomic type thing comes in, it closes your mind, you fall into the one brain, but you got your the blood going away from your gut into your muscle, your bronchis dilate, your pupil dilate, your saliva goes, all those kind of stuff, really. You get that... you get crushed by your autonomic nervous system, really, in order to be like you're a puppet in a way, really, in order to survive, really. You can't be like, oh, well, hold on, are the daisies and the dandelion really well at this time of the year, really? You can't, that's impossible, really. You die. Or people who were actually able to access those kind of things whilst being in that flat and fright response, where they've been all eaten, they've been weeded out, they've not been able to reproduce, they've not able to have children, they've not able to pass on the pattern of behavior and the way they were expressing their genetic material, really. So we've been really bred into responding in that fashion, really. And it's a very normal thing. And people who have got anxiety, they feel that it's really abnormal, really. But actually, it's not abnormal at all. The main problem is they don't know what the activating agent is. As soon as you know what the activating agent is, as soon as you know what the context it's happening, and if you get if you were traumatized and you were able to go through that rewind technique to just like de-arouse you and desensitize the response your body is having in light of that activating agent, well, all of a sudden, that's it. Next, you pass on to another one, really. But the world is likely to traumatize you again because there's chaos all the time. Yeah. The uncertainty of the future is what we deal with all the time. And our brain is really well equipped for that, really. But problem is people get stuck into one thing because the society and people they talk to have got no idea about the model and how it actually really works about it, really.
But it's also not just the model, because I'm sure there are other models, or there are other models that are quite successful or very, and there will be more models probably in the future. But people don't have any idea of how our bodies respond to things like that. It's like, oh, I have anxiety. Again, it's like people seem happy with that label. It's like, no, that's the title of maybe this chapter. And the actual chapter is much, much more complex than that. And if you want, you can go on a journey and actually learn about that and maybe write a nice ending to that chapter. And then the next chapter
But that's your thought. That's your thought.
Of oppression,
Yeah.
of trauma or whatever else starts. But the more you're able to work through your anxiety, and I believe that this model and the science behind it is like a great place to start. The more you're able to work through one anxiety, like next time you have an anxiety, you're probably going to get quite a bit better at working through that.
But the problem is anxiety is a bit of a peculiar definition of an experience you're having. So we go back to that phenomenological type thing. It's your experience that actually, and the interpretation of your experience. You're an adrenaline junkie. You're about to base jump from Big Ben. You're having the same sensation that somebody who's anxious of talking in front of the public in a way, really. So two people have got the same sensation but interpret it in a different fashion. The thought you're having in light of the emotion is different, really. And in the two cases, the pattern matching is a bit different, but the sensation is the same. That's the thing, really.
Yeah, that's why
in a way,
it's
really,
almost
okay?
become a bit of a the word anxiety.
But
has become a bit of a
nominalization. Yeah,
and it's not really about focusing on I have anxiety or I have this disorder or I have this or even worse, I am this. I am anxious.
I am anxious. That's it.
It's better to focus on here's a model, and when something happens, sit down, write down some of the things.
But not when it happens, because when you're anxious, you can't really work out the whole lot. Really, you need to be really calm and really composed and de-aroused in order to be able to analyze the whole lot and look. And it's like. So that's another resource as well about being able to dissociate yourself. You're able to look at yourself you're able to be conscious of yourself being conscious. That's the whole sapiens. That's where the whole thing comes really very importantly. But that you're not able to do that when you're legging it and your body is preparing you to fly away from danger or what you perceive as being danger. Okay? That's the main thing, really. So you cannot try to analyze the whole lot when you're aroused. And when you go and see a therapist, if you're bawling your eyes off or you're having an anxiety attack, you can go 65,000 times more to them and re-experience the whole lot until you're able to maybe override with your cortical activity and your thought is changing about how the experience is. But it takes an awful long time, really. And it's a bit masochistic. You have to really rehearse the whole lot again and again and again. You need to face your fear, or you need to face the chaos. You need to face the whole lot, and you need to put the head in it in order for you to look at it differently. Or how Peterson is talking about it from a Jungian point of view, in a way, and a psychotherapeutical point of view, you get exposed to the whole lot willingly, in a way. So you go there, and you want to go there.
You're jumping in.
It's your
choice.
It's your choice, which actually changes the whole thing a bit. But by actually looking at the activating agent, the pattern matching, the sensation you're having, and the thoughts that leads to that, and looking at the whole thing in that sequence, you don't have to be exposed to it too many times, and you can actually do so without being aroused. And I think that's the main thing. You must not be emotionally aroused when you're having therapy.
Yeah.
Because it's actually preventing you from actually looking at yourself, experiencing the whole stuff.
Yeah.
And it prevents you from using your imagination properly. It prevents you from really understanding the pattern matching. It prevents you from really using your cognitive abilities.
So another term that they coined, cartexture, which I think you mentioned already, context blindness. So that's the same thing again. If you're anxious or really emotionally aroused by something, whatever it might be, quite often, from my personal experience, when I've I know to do some breathing or go on a walk. Like those are two great tools that we all have. Deep breathing and walking that tend to de-arouse you. But there's been many times that I've gone for a walk or I've done some breathing and still my mind has been quite, I like to say, psychotic about focusing on these in particular pieces of detail within the situation that I'm in. And usually that's like something that someone said or something like that. And it's like, so you can do something you can use one of your tools of breathing and walking to try and de-arouse yourself, but all that time you're not actually doing anything because you're focusing way too much on this one thing. Again, contextually blind, your body's full of adrenaline, cortisol and all these things that your body gives you when you're fight or flight. And
you've got a fixed state of attention.
Yeah, and then you're still not going to be able to get to the bottom of what the anxiety or whatever it is about.
And then you talk to me now and you don't feel your glasses because you were paying attention to me. But as soon as I mention your glasses, you can feel them. So nonetheless, when you got that thought in your head and you're walking and you're trying to do the breathing and you still have focusing on the whole lot, you are fixed onto that thing rather than being able to take the whole encompassing thing and smell the air. So you need to do the breathing, but you need to maybe smell the air, try to figure out what how it smells, and
put your focus on other sensations,
other senses, in order to completely refocus on the whole forest. Really, you're focused on the tree too much. Really, in a way, really.
Yeah.
But that's the whole thing. You're having an argument with your girlfriend or your partner, whatever, or your wife or your husband, and then you go a bit ape about the whole lot, and then there's a pattern matching, the rapport is not able to be happening, and then you get completely aroused, the whole thing doesn't go anywhere, and then you're like, okay, well, I'm going to go outside, have a cigarette, and we'll talk about it when I come back, really. No, because you need to maybe sleep on it. Let's sleep on it, let's talk about it tomorrow. And you have to go back tomorrow and having relayed the whole lot, and you need to have your head to have actually had the opportunity to focus on other things in order to revisit the whole thing. And maybe, well, start the conversation a bit differently. And if you start the conversation the same, with the same sentence and the whole lot, bang! That's it, really, okay?
And then once again, same thing with therapy. If you're in that state with a partner or a friend, and you started the conversation the same way, voices have started to heighten, there's nothing you can do.
There's nothing.
So you have to leave it.
That's it.
And then come back to it another day.
Revisit it another day. Yeah. Not in 15 minutes, no in half an hour. You will not have been able to de-arouse yourself and defocus yourself enough on a whole lot, and your partner or the person you're talking to as well. So you need to focus on something and talk. There's so many other things to talk about anyway.
Yeah, and I think that brings us really nicely onto sleep and the expectation fulfillment theory of dream, which again, from my personal experience, is always the strongest tool that I've ever experienced to like de-arouse myself. And often that's because fatigue doesn't help with being, contextually blind. But also the expectation fulfillment theory of dream, where essentially in your dreams you get an expectation that has been opened during the day.
Has loaded your autonomic nervous system as well. So you're onto your adrenal,
which is what actually makes you, it's what can or should motivate you to act on that expectation.
On that expectation, that's it. With your dopamine, but you need to be wording the whole thing pretty well, and you need to be intentional in the way you actually do it. That's the whole lot, really. So, because dopamine is about intention, your intention, so logos, the way you articulate the whole lot, really. So, to try to fulfill that need, you need to be really clear about what is it you're going to do to achieve it, and what is it it's going to give you, in a way, okay? And then, if you can't do that, well, at night, you're going to have to, in your REM, because that's the whole thing, really. It's not really... The REM is enabling you to de-arouse you. It's enabling you to learn. It's enabling you to that whole daydreaming. It enables you to pattern match. It enables you to rehearse all the pattern of behaviors that are helping you to actually walk and breathe and do your thermoregulation, all those kind of stuff. So it's a very quite strange. Your dream is inside the REM. And you're learning. I saw my daughter like that. For a couple of days, she was obsessed about putting a key into a lock. I mean, like 2 days, could not do the whole lot, and she could not do it. She didn't have the motor skill to do it, and she rehearsed it. There was only one thing. I was a bit worried she might be autistic a bit at that stage. Not quite, but she had really fixed state of attention, and she went to bed for her nap lunchtime, and then she woke up, came downstairs, she had a bit of bits and bobs, a bit of water, took the key, it went into the lock, and it was that. Last time she played with it for 5 more minutes, and it was that, done. So it's not until she went to sleep that all the whole motor coordination and the integration of the whole lot, her eye-hand coordination, all the different reflexes got a bit rehearsed and properly done, bang, and she was able to actually do the whole task. So she had learned that whole learning thing. My generation, when I was going to school, we had lovely teachers who were quite hands-on. And there was a bit of corporal punishment with rulers and all sorts of things, and ringless hands and all sorts of things, really. And which is interesting-ish. But I don't hold a grudge, and there was nothing unfair about that. I'm not, I think it can be quite a good thing as well. But the main problem is I got clipped in the back of the head several times when I was actually daydreaming in the classroom. And that's a bit, for a teacher, that's a bit of a lack of knowledge. And maybe the knowledge at the time was not very there. But when you're in daydreaming mode, you're in the REM and you're actually learning. So it's actually the teacher should be really grateful. The kid is actually daydreaming in his course, in his lesson, unless he daydreams from the word go, okay? But after 20 minutes or half an hour, the kid is daydreaming and he's going to integrate the new information and try to slot it into the knowledge he already has, and try to integrate it and make it function into his new knowledge, which is what the REM does at night as well, okay? So as teachers, do not disrupt kids who are daydreaming in your lessons, because that's when they actually do the learning, okay? Not when you repeat the stuff the 15th time in the same fashion, okay? That's definitely, as a pedagogue, you have to really understand that the brain does the whole teaching, okay? You don't. You just bring the information, and the brain actually is, during that daydreaming, is able to actually slot it and integrate it perfectly with the previous information, in a way, and previous knowledge. So that's an awesome stuff. Like the whole REM is really, really quite interesting and very, very critical thing for our evolution, in a way, really. So you're able to actually integrate new patterns into the set of patterns you already have, really. So it becomes quite a big thing, really.
And you spoke before about how with the pattern matching, it's a crude pattern matching, and us practicing it in sleep obviously is or kind of practicing it or doing the pattern matching in our REM sleep is a really important process for us for learning. And so, to the point where babies do it in the womb with regards to suckling the mother's teeth, and because it's crude.
Or facial expressions, or things like that, really. So, my baby is smiling. No, it just mimics the way you do in order for you to empathize and be laden with oxytocin in order to be able to have rapport with your baby and to be able to nurture him. Okay? And that's prolactin does quite a lot of that, and a lot of things from even men tend to have a bit the whole effect like that. There's quite a bit of an interesting effect from having a baby in a way, and that's why the baby looks like his dad. I looked at my firstborn, and I was looking at myself. Really, it's really weird how it goes, because it's obviously not you. It's obviously not you, but nature has put things in place in order for you straight away to completely be in love with that little creature. Straight away. Mm-hmm. You're there. If there was just one benefit of being at my present for the birth of my kids, was to really experience that. Really, you're glued. That's it. Ping. You're imprinted, branded. That's it.
And that's why people say there's nothing like having your own baby, or there's nothing like being a parent or whatever.
Yeah, that's it. And for moms to actually be able to breastfeed and things like that, there's so many advantages, and bizarrely, the prolactin is having an effect on the mom's amount of REM sleep in her sleep. So the prolactin is going to change the way the brain is actually splitting the sleep into slow wave sleep and REM. And is going to increase the allocation of REM in order for the mom to be able to deal better with the emotional upheaval from having a new kid and having to maybe meet the need of the kid before meeting her own need and things like that. And therefore, she doesn't have enough slow wave sleep. And that's why a lot of moms have got cavities, they lose their hair after a while of breastfeeding, bone density, all aches and pains, all those kind of things, really. There's
because your slow wave sleep helps your body repair
yourself.
Peripherally.
Yeah. Or bodily. It's a bodily repair rather than a mind repair.
And your mind will take more REM sleep.
Yeah.
And in adults, it's supposed to be something like 25% REM sleep, 75 slow wave.
Yeah.
But your mind would take more, so it would be more like 50-50 or something.
I'm not too sure. I'm not sure exactly.
Or whatever. Obviously, it would change, but it would change in that direction. And then your body is healing itself less because it needs more REM sleep.
That's maybe it needs. I'm not too sure, but that's what we notice, and maybe evolutionarily speaking, that has got an advantage, and the advantage is maybe for the mom to be able to process the fact that she now cannot focus on herself anymore. So because oxytocin as well, so that's the prolactin, but there's oxytocin, there's all other sort of hormonal surges and things like that, which actually make you a mom will throw herself in front of a car to save her kid, really. She's completely selfless to a point where it's actually she's possibly quite dangerous in a way, really.
Possibly, yeah.
In a way,
I mean, yeah.
Okay.
And that, I think, as an idea, separate from childbirth, but also related to childbirth, is unbelievable for me. Like with regards to, we're obviously talking a lot about chronic pain and our course on pain. It's like not only are your expectations that are unmanaged or not met, shall we say?
Or you think you don't mind.
Yeah. But if you've got that expectation, that's where it is.
But no. It's how much you think your need is met and how much your need is really met. And the difference between the two. So you're actually getting stress from something that mostly...
that's where your expectation is. Your expectation isn't getting met. Whether you need that expectation or not is a separate thing. You set that expectation and it's not getting met. So
it's a want or a need a bit different.
Your body is then taking more REM sleep, taking more than its fair share, shall we say, of REM sleep, and therefore your body is repairing itself at a lesser rate. And for people who are really active, people who have fibromyalgia and things like that, that can be massively detrimental very quickly because often they'll be exercising, carrying on as normal, but then their body's not repairing. And obviously within childbirth, there's an awful lot of physical parts of a woman that need to repair properly, and like you say, with their lips and their hair and things like that, often those
their teeth.
or the teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah, because their body is taking more REM sleep.
That's it.
They're not able to.
From the breastfeeding, from some of
cells.
the hormones that actually stimulate the mammillary gland in order for the woman to have a bit the surge in milk. The whole prolactin part of it is actually affecting the way your brain deals with sleep and changes the whole thing. I mean, it's just like the way it's put together is completely. It's insane, really.
Yeah.
It's just like bonkers, really.
It is nuts. It's
So
really crazy.
babies coming out of the womb are pattern matching and rehearsing in their. I get babies. I unwind them and try to really newborn. I try to unwind them and find a bit the whole tension in their diaphragm, in their pelvis, in their skull, at the base of their skull and thing. And then when they come to fall asleep, they go into their REM. You can see them with their eyes going all over the place, and then they start to smile, they start to ground, they pull faces. It's the sequence of firing of different muscle in your face to do your facial expression needs to be rehearsed by the baby every REM for you not to lose it before you're able to actually consciously recruit it in order to be able to have rapport with people consciously. In a way, okay? And you can mimic people's facial expression. So the baby needs to be in contact with people in order to be able to see the person, and then the brain actually matches their facial expression in order to be able to actually engage with them and then get their needs met, because they are a bit useless.
It's
babies.
starting from an early age on how to build rapport with that person.
That's it.
And mimicking.
But
the
it's
way-
a very automated and a very reflex-based thing, basically. Yeah. But you want your parent to actually do things for you because you're completely you're useless. You're completely useless. So that's the main problem of encephalization and the fact that the brain is getting bigger. We tend to have babies who are born who are completely useless. That's it. And we're going to spend an awful long time at training them, possibly, well, I don't know how long it takes to train a human to be a human, really. But it takes a little while, really, compared to for an elk to become an elk. You come out, you take the placenta, you take the afterbirth, and then you get on your legs and on you go, really.
Yeah.
The 2 hours or 3 hours later, you should be able to get away from predators, really. That's the thing, really. Bing, douche, that's done. And then you're an elk, that's it, finished. So your mom doesn't have to teach you an awful lot, really. She can just supplement a bit your diet a little bit and wait for a few bits and bobs to happen. But like a baby, it's just like
months and months. Well, it takes years.
Years and years to actually be able to do for the person, for an individual to be independent in a way, really. And nowadays, well, with all those mental health and all those the way society goes about it, we get even.
It's even longer before people.
Well, yes, that's it.
Yeah.
And the lack of information and the lack of knowledge about the way who we are tend to be a bit of a hurdle for a lot of people, really. And the skills they have is not very conducive for them to be sociabilized very well, really. And depressed people spend a lot of time, they are quite agoraphobic, they got a fear of the marketplace, it's called. And they don't spend much time in town, really, in shops and in cafes, talking with other people and things like that. They tend to spend time at home in their beds, really, on their own, really. And that's becoming quite a tricky thing, really, the motivation and thing. Anyway, so, yeah, the whole resources of having your imagination, your rapport, your pattern matching, your ability to look at yourself in a way, really, and dissociate a bit yourself and see a bit of being conscious are really super important in a way. And then after, yes, there's all the needs that we talk always about. There's a Maslow and the hierarchy of needs again, or another hierarchy, oh my God. And then danger.
But it kind of has to be a hierarchy, right? Because otherwise, which one do you start with?
But that's it. And then we can...
And we made that, we individually every single day make that a hierarchy by literally ordering those needs in a hierarchy.
Yeah. And they are needs. If you have got no control in your life and you can't really financially secure yourself, or you're not very safe in the environment you're in, and you got no status, and you're not too sure how to get people's attention and things like that. If you think of getting something greater than you and the aspiration for something altruistic and something that is spiritual or religious, and you get down that road, maybe you miss the point a bit. You miss the point. You need to meet certain things before, and then after you can do the whole lot. Yeah, you need to help yourself before helping others. There's that. So after we talk about being a bit selfish, really, and I think there is a degree of selfishness that is needed in order for people to be able to cater for others. In a way, really. If you're a dysfunctional person, it's going to be difficult for you to deal with other people. And we see a lot of professions who the way they are trained and the way the whole thing is going, and the way they've learned things and the way they use their brain and the way the demand of the information they have is putting pressure on the way they use their brain, they don't tend to be very socially apt, really, in a way, really. So a lot of people in caring professions leave the danger of elderlies on the table, and demented people have got the jug of water on the side and they don't drink all day because nobody really cares really about simple stuff really. So it becomes a bit tricky in a way. And how is it you interact with people? How is it you can, empathize or sympathize, or maybe not, but all the rest really. How is it you go about being a human around other humans in a way really, and certain statuses and profession tend to prevent you a bit from doing that really in a way really. But
I think that's a nice intro into a lot of the mental health side of things, or the I guess human givens.
And the more we
framework,
the more we read about it, the more we talk about it, the more we the more we have therapy ourselves from a human given perspective, the more we experience the whole lot, the more insight we have, the more we digest a bit all the knowledge, the more we integrate it, the more we pattern match it within our own set of knowledge really. So the better we are at actually articulating the whole thing. I think that's the interesting part of it.
Yeah, the more content we have on the human givens context.
That's it, yeah. And the more we've integrated it, and the more we experience it, the more we go to, or not the more, but I don't know, like going to a human givens therapist several times, give you an idea, having had a rewind technique, I don't know, I had a phobia of needles at one stage, and my sister could have, who's a nurse, could have done phlebotomy on me and try to take some bloods for years on me. I would still have been passing out at the sight of the whole thing going in, really. And I had the rewind done on a course, and I did a workshop in Bristol about it, and about trauma, and what we were talking about, and then we did the rewind about that situation. I remembered exactly which context it happened, and when it happened, and before that I had no problem, and then after that event I had a bit of a problem, and it's an electrician who did the rewind technique on me, and then I shook his hand saying, "Oh, wow, well done, oh, good job," and saying, but I didn't feel any different really, and thank God it was about taking bloods really, so you don't have to do that every morning before brushing your teeth really. So my phobia was really a bit almost something that could be socialized in a way. It was not crossing the road really.
But did it work?
And the first time I went to the doctor and the nurse took my blood, I didn't even know how it was done. So I was a bit like, it's not a syringe, it's like a little file. And then there's an anticoagulant at the bottom, look at the jelly there. And then she was looking, it was like I had to make a new memory out of the whole lot. I had to re-imprint my brain about the thing. And actually, I had never really looked at it because every time I was passed out before it was even happening, really.
Huh.
Okay? So I had never really seen the whole stuff happen. Or you don't look, so you don't really see it, really. And for the first time, I was looking at it being like a kid in a candy shop. It was really most peculiar, really. To experience the whole lot was really peculiar and not have the whole autonomic stuff happening at all, really. Despite knowing that I was having a phobia of having my blood taken, and the lady had told me she was going to take my blood. Okay, so there was the thought of it was completely clear. That's it, really. The T of APET was completely clear. And then it's in a room like at the doctor's surgery, so it's the whole environment is the same a bit, all the same, really. And it's a nurse. She's got her stuff who's written, I'm a nurse, or I'm a nurse. You can see it this way. She comes with your little tray, all those kind of stuff, really. So it's exactly the same routine, exactly the same thing, but you don't have the freeze part of it, really. You pass out if I play dead, maybe she's not going to do it.
Yeah. But that's was it fight or flight and freeze?
Yeah, that's it. Well, we could talk a bit more about polyvagal theory.
I bet we could.
At some stage about all the evolutionary stuff and myelinated and unmyelinated part of the vagus nerve and the cardiopulmonary and the digestive part, but that's another story. It's all the physiology of feeling safe. It's really it's amazing, really. Again, and it's really evolutionary. It's really it's mind-bending, really, and it can be really used in your understanding of the whole lot. It's actually absolutely fab, really. So I had a freeze part of it, which is a bit that cardiopulmonary stuff. It's your heart to actually send you the feedback, and then you have to actually equilibrate the blood pressure, so you faint, you play dead, boom. You stop a bit breathing as well, which is not really helping too much, but hopefully you come back to it a bit fast. That's it. So so it's quite, it's awesome, those stuff, experiencing the whole result of the therapy itself and some of the therapeutical technique when applied even by somebody that the guy was an electrician. But he had been explained on a day course. He did the whole lot about that rewind technique is storytelling. So we talk about myth after all the rest and things. There's quite a lot. It's so exciting, really. So, yeah. Or anyway, reality or not quite reality, metaphor, all the rest and things, really. The whole suggestive part of it and things like that, really, how story heal a little bit, and there's some really absolutely amazing stuff about all that, really. It opens you up to an interesting way of using your brain and seeing a bit how you respond to your changing environment and how you condition your hair and things. It's like, I think we need to shout about it, and I guess the podcasts are really excellent for that, really. Yeah. We need to shout about it on all the bloody wavelengths, really, to try to have more and more people looking at it that way, really, in order to maybe try to find new patterns of behaviors and see what is stored in our DNA and what we can express a little bit in that changing environment. And there's even more need for the evolutionary pressure. The environment is changing too fast and we are a bit like, it's not fair. Well, yeah, that's not going to help.
No, that's not going to help people express. That's not going to help people change.
And feel safe.
Yeah.
And not be catechic. And all the rest, really. and focus on the things that matter most. And that's why we go back to the whole thought about our idea about no fuel Sunday, really, or no credit card Sunday, or no cash Sunday, or
stop consuming Sunday.
Stop consuming Sunday, really. Stop using money on Sunday, because you need to consume other things. You need to consume togetherness, you need to consume community, you need to consume a meaningful relationship with others, maybe a bit of intimacy, a bit of, like all the whole thing about attention, status, the whole lot. You need to try to look at all those needs in a bit of a different fashion than the mercantile and using your credit card fashion, really.
It's our Mr. Peterson always talks about Nietzsche saying God is dead.
Yeah.
And I think it was in Maps and Meaning he reads that, or half that chapter, or paragraph or something. And you can really hear from when Nietzsche is saying God is dead that he's saying we have killed him, and that he is dead. But he's not. It's not a celebration. It's like what have we done, and what are we going to replace it with?
But that's it. We need a new story. We need a new myth.
And
we need a scientific myth.
The idea of that story being completely useless, because a lot of people, again, I see it as like interpreted it very much with their left brain, and the way that we read stories and interpret stories is very different to how they were.
When we believe.
Yeah,
So it uses you. It uses you.
Yeah. And the way the doctrine was taught in the Western world was probably very different to how it was in the Eastern world, and I believe it was very different to how the Bible was intended. But also all the other religions and Bibles. All talk about
books
or stories
or myth.
Or myth. They often talk about having a rest, or like the Sabbath and things like that. And I think in today's world, it's almost like they felt the need for it back then. I
need to go to the shop on Sunday because I want to have a feel at what I buy, and I don't have time to do that the rest of the week. That's it. So that's it. So you can't have any rest about the whole lot. Why is it? How wrong is it to have one day where you don't consume and you do other things? Because there's other things that need to be done, really. And that's the thing. That's an individual-led thing. The more people stay at home on Sunday or go to their neighbors on foot on Sunday, and they might have to use the agar still to cook the lamb or things like that, really, and that they've bought during the week, no doubt. But that's the thing, really, because the lamb is not going to appear in the agar like that, really. So, but to have a day where you actually celebrate other things and not mercantile and not profiteering and not consuming type story. And you can talk to each other and exchange ideas and see a bit what there is in other people's brains, a bit, really, rather than in other people's wallets and things like that, really. How is it you can go about doing that, really? And maybe some people are going to want to have a day off on Friday because they go to the mosque, and others is going to be on Saturday, others is going to be on Sunday, but we could have Friday, Saturday, and Sunday all together, really.
Or just one day of the week. Some people might work Friday,
That's
Sunday.
it, exactly.
But you can definitely find, and it's going to be better for you mentally. Like, it's definitely going to be better for you in every way. It's going to be better for your wallet. You're probably going to be a little bit more organized. You can have that day away from consuming or buying or using money or whatever.
Organizing the rest of your week.
And
once you've done a food plan or a bit of a meal plan, well, actually, you can go and shop, and then you shop for the meals, and therefore you don't shop more, and therefore you waste a bit less food, and less food means you waste less money, and there's less trash around, all the rest, really. Those kind of things is as simple as that, really. You don't have to stop buying food and stop using money, but you can maybe take a bit of stock and reflect on all the whole lot, really, and maybe take ideas from others and all the rest, really.
And share your ideas.
And share your ideas.
And just the idea of spending more, consuming something different, spending more time with people, talking, reading, playing games.
Yeah. So it's brilliant in English because you got two words. You say there's a rich man and there's a wealthy man. So we need to get a bit richer, not wealthier. And I think that's quite a great way of looking at it, really. It's about consuming and buying into other stuff to make you rich, really. Your rich is your culture, is your community, is your family, is all those different nuclei, really, in a way, really, that are enabling you to, stand on both your feet and be a human, really. Because Robinson, on his little island, on his own, until Friday turns up, he loses it completely. He becomes he's a beast, really. He starts to try to seed the earth with his spank, really. And it turns out it's a bit into a weird way. He loses it. He becomes mentally ill. And Friday comes, and then all of a sudden, it all happens. Apparently, it's a Friday. It could have been called Sunday. Would have been better, but hey ho. No, that's it. All those interesting parts, really, and the link it has on society and all the rest, really, and diplomacy and
us individually.
That's it. Everything.
Cool.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you, Alexei.
It was really great to talk to you again.
I enjoyed that perambulation with you.
That's it. Let's perambulate. We're going to perambulate around the same thing for a little while, I guess. But there's lots to talk about, and it would be good to have another person. So please come along if you want to contact us and you want to speak with us, or we want to hear you as well speak with us in order to expand a bit our knowledge about things, really. We are very happy to agree to disagree. No problem. We don't have to have the same ideas, in the contrary, and I think it's great to articulate different things in order to expand our horizons, to get rid of that echo chamber a little bit, if possible.
Nicely put.
Yeah.
Let's leave it there.
Ciao.
Bon.